This is the Village podcast with part 3 in a series on law and literature with barrister David Langwell. This episode will cover miscarriages of justice in real life and in literature. David, where will we start?
Thank you, Luke. I think we broke off on the last occasion dealing with Voltaire and his involvement in the Calais case, the Le Barre case, and others. In fact, he ultimately was responsible for 2 posthumous pardons, and he was a one-man miscarriage of justice machine. But the greatest miscarriage of justice machine in literature of all time was the legendary French novelist Emile Zola. And the whole thing is fascinating. By 1896, Zola and Victor Hugo, of whom more later, were the 2 most famous writers in France. And Zola's books were selling in the truckloads. He had just come off 2 massive hits, Nana and Germinal, I think it's the other way around. And he was, with Hugo, the greatest man of letters in France. And he was quite a private, apolitical person. And a poet called Lazare came up to him about the Dreyfus affair. Dreyfus was a Jewish officer who was court-martialed, framed, and sent to Devil's Island, which was the colony that the French also sent the famous criminal Henry Charrier, immortalized as Papillon.
In French Guiana.
Exactly. You know, a bit like Napoleon in Elba from a French point of view, as far away as possible. Yeah, and punitive, very draconian and punitive. And Lazare comes up to, initially Zola's reluctant. I mean, he doesn't really like to get involved. They had been lobbying him to be a politician. It wasn't his game. His entire career had been about exposing French injustice, siding with the poor, siding with the marginalized. That's where all his books are about. And he was decidedly anti-clerical and anti-state, really. So he agrees. The famous pamphlet, which we'll get to, is J'accuse. We said in the earlier episode, my view is that Swift's Our Modest Proposal was the greatest essay of all time. There is no question that the greatest article or headline of all time is J'accuse, but we'll come to it in a second, because there's a whole succession of things beforehand. Initially, he publishes Condemnation, Zola, about the Dreyfus affair from the perspective of the established French newspaper then and now, Le Figaro. And it just becomes too much for Le Figaro. He has an article criticizing anti-Semitism. We've persecuted them for 1,800 years. He identifies precisely the anti-Semitism in attacking Dreyfus. And then he dovetails into his famous anti-clericism. He calls these people who convicted Dreyfus in a military context professional poison distillers in the name of Christ, obedient to a special state of mind. And then remarkably, in one article called The Syndicate, he touches on the sort of theme that the QRN people, if that's what they're called, these right-wing conspiracy theorists, there's a word for it, QNN or QAnon. QAnon. And he has a particular article in this called The Syndicate. He's going, where is this Jewish conspiracy? Where is this Jewish syndicate? These are different people. And some of them are Christians. I mean, this is all baloney. Then Le Figaro have had enough, They're not going to keep publishing this endless, beautifully written vitriol that he's publishing. So he goes to a newly published magazine called L'Aurora, and he writes J'accuse. I mean, to read it today is absolutely astonishing. It's so incredibly condemnatory of the French authorities, the French system, the trial process. He gets a few things slightly wrong. He's writing off the hoof, but the end of it is extraordinary. It goes like this. This letter is long, Mr. President, and it's time for me to conclude it. I accuse Lieutenant Blah Blah of being the diabolical creator of this miscarriage of justice, unknowingly, I'm willing to believe, and of defending this sorry deed over the last 3 years by all manner of bizarre and evil machinations. I accuse another general of complicity and of mental weakness. I accuse another general, I'm cutting it as I'm going on, being guilty of crimes against mankind and justice and of saving the face of the general staff. I accuse other generals of complicity in the same crime. I accuse them of conducting a fraudulent inquiry and a monstrously biased inquiry. I accuse the handwriting experts of submitting deceitful and fraudulent reports. So that was wrong. I accuse the officers of the War Office of using the press to conduct an abominable campaign to mislead public opinion and cover up their own wrongdoing. I accuse the court-martial of violating the law, the rules of evidence, covering up illegality, and committing the crime of acquitting the guilty man with full knowledge of his guilt. That is, they convicted the innocent, Dreyfus, and acquitted the guilty, Esterhazy. And then, this final incredible thing. In making these accusations, I'm aware that I'm making myself liable to Article 31 of the law on the press, making it a punishable offence. I expose myself to that risk voluntarily. As for the people I'm accusing, I do not know them, I have never seen them, and I bear them neither ill will nor hatred. To me, they are mere entities, agents of harm to society. The action I'm taking is no more than a radical measure to hasten the explosion of truth and justice. I have but one passion, the search for light, in the name of humanity, which has suffered so much and is entitled to happiness. My fury protest is simply the cry of my very soul. Let them there, then, to bring me before a court of law and investigate in the full light of day. I am waiting. It's extraordinary. Imagine publishing something like that today. They'd hang you. They very nearly hung him. He was prosecuted for libel. And despite giving massive evidence in his behalf, and he was nearly stoned outside the building because half the country wanted to lynch him. There was a lynch mob. They sentenced him to 11 months. This is Zola in prison, and he hopscotches off to London for 11 months as a point of refuge. But it doesn't end then. Ultimately, what happens is there's a presidential pardon of Dreyfus, there's and then a retrial. What really stokes Zola's anger is in the retrial, they cover up again. They convict Dreyfus again. Ultimately, he's acquitted. There are a whole series of fantastic articles he writes towards the end, after J'accuse about all of this. And he really sticks the boot in an incredible way to them. Some of the things he says about politicians, they are bustling in a void of their own nonentities. And all I want to do is puncture the putrefied boil. Once I release the poison from the system, we will get some form of cleansing and truth out of all of it. And it's the greatest act of journalistic and literary courage in the history of literature. And they're wonderful reads, every one of them, from the first one to the last, those essays. Extraordinary stuff.
Dreyfus was exonerated eventually, right?
That's right. He was completely exonerated. He was pardoned, completely exonerated, despite a second military. Zola also did what the Innocence Project call aftercare. He spoke to Dreyfus, he spoke to his wife. Dreyfus went on to a relatively glittering career afterwards.
He got the Legion d'Honneur, didn't he? And then he did some service in World War One, but I don't think he fought.
Very good service in World War One. And there was a great plus to Zola. Zola didn't live very much longer. And I don't think the quality of his books afterwards was quite the same as before. He did write his very last novel, Zola, La Vérité, Truth, he had promised not to write anything or profit from the Dreyfus affair. But there's no doubt his final novel, published after his death in 1906, Truth, La Vérité, was about framing an anti-Semitism. And based loosely on the Dreyfus affair, and also full of his hatred of the French establishment. I mean, the French establishment are nauseating, or were at that time. And there's a film by Stanley Kubrick late about the First World War, speaking of Dreyfus being a war hero, called and it's based on the Cohn a corporal's affair, where the establishment just execute these people because they've had a botched, their fault, invasion in the front line in the First World War with thousands of unnecessary casualties. And they accuse them of treason and so forth for an establishment cover-up. I mean, all of this is very redolent of the whole McCabe scandal in Ireland and the way the Irish establishment covers up. The establishment never apologizes. It tries to cover its tracks. Or what it does is it puts a few sacrificial lambs to exonerate the truly guilty people. And of course, there's no doubt that Zola is pointing the finger. Do you know what I mean? You, general, you, prime minister, you people at the
Exactly.
top, you're responsible, not this guy,
And that is
And
still a brave thing to do today. If you think of it, people at the last minute, I think they compose their diatribes and then they will try and hedge things. They know that pointing the finger at power is dangerous. But here he's doing it so openly and it's so rhetorical and it's so flamboyant, isn't it?
Yes, in fact, funny enough, he says that himself, and Voltaire says the same thing. Voltaire has a quote about it that being right where the establishment are wrong is always
It's
dangerous.
dangerous.
But then going further and literally going for them, accusing them of cognitive bias. The whole thing is full of Innocence Project stuff. Jumping to conclusions, obedient, he says, to a special state of mind. The previous quote, or deputies are puppets who bustle in a void. I often feel that's true of politicians in Ireland as well. It's the people behind them, the top lawyers, the judges, the civil servants who control the agenda. And
Right.
he talks about judging the judges who
Yeah.
frame the innocent and save the guilty,
Right.
lancing the boil on a putrefied system to expose the puzzle within. I mean, it's extraordinary stuff and really, really brave. And not just brave, he had a lot to lose. He could have been imprisoned. He didn't know the Dreyfus people. He was reluctant. Though his novels are very against injustice and poverty and social degradation, there is no sense that he was a political man in the political sense, a party politician type. So it was extraordinary stuff. And it definitely shortened his life.
I'm have to say, I have to admit, I'm secretly admiring of the way he legged it to London.
Yeah, it is always, is it Sidney Caron or something? Better to walk away to live to fight another day. If he had stayed, none of it would have come out, you
A bit
know?
like Voltaire. Didn't you mention that Voltaire? No, he went to
Voltaire,
Switzerland.
yeah, Voltaire. Well, Voltaire also had to leg it to London.
At some point he did, didn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, earlier he had to leg it to London. Because a lot of it was, in Voltaire's case, similar to Zola, anti-clericism,
Right.
anti-state. But Voltaire also was hugely ambiguous in his connections with the establishment. Various kings tried Catherine the Great and so on. And they all loved him. And even Louis XIV or whatever liked him to some degree. So he was both ostracized and protected simultaneously.
Mhm.
Whereas Zola had limited protection. He did have people like Clemenceau, who subsequently became Prime Minister of France. And in fact, Clemenceau is responsible for the fuck up that was Versailles. And Clemenceau was a bit of a demagogue. It is said that Clemenceau came up with the title J'accuse, that
Mm.
wasn't Zola's title. And it's extraordinary stuff. And, more so than Voltaire, it is huge courage. The next thing I'd like I said in the last broadcast that I left a couple of things absent from my discussion in relation to novels of the 19th century in particular, and that's because they referred to earlier periods. So, for example, it is common cause that Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter is one of the great books of all time, but it was written in the 19th century. But it's not about the 19th century. It's about the Salem witch hunts. And there's a
Mhm.
huge literature on witch hunts. There's Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter in the 20th century. There's Arthur Miller's The Crucible. There's the famous book about the Rosenbergs by Robert Coover called The Public Burning. And then, of course, about Sacco and Vancetti, there is that wonderful play made into a film called The Front Page. I mean, and that's just some.
Might be
But
worth mentioning, seeing as we started with the Elizabethans, and I didn't say it at that moment, but when Shakespeare created Macbeth, he had at the back of his mind the new king's obsession with witches.
that's a very
Texts,
interesting point. Yes, of
the
course.
weird that they the weird texts that were then later on used to justify even I think the trials in Salem. These kind of late medieval Malleus Maleficarum, these sort of studies of witches, kooky books.
Yeah, I mean, there's some extraordinary themes in all of the texts. In the Scarlet Letter, a woman conceives a child out of marriage, and she is forced to go into, in a sense, a mock execution structure, the gallows, so that adultery is branded on her and has to live with that, and her child has to live with the shame of that for the entirety of the book. The denouement is that the person who had relations with her himself sacrificed himself and brands on himself. But also, there's the attitude of social exclusion by the community. As well as that, the themes, I think, brilliantly dealt with. I mean, also by Arthur Miller. I mean, at the
Yeah.
beginning of the Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne goes through the record in Salem. He's pretending to look at old documents in the customs house area, and it sets a great scene and picture of what it was and what it was like. Miller went through the entire trial record in Salem before writing Crucible, and the things the Crucible says are incredibly relevant to our time, it seems to me. The most important thing is Miller's lines in the play about crucial to prosecuting witches or people as witches of spectral evidence or invisible evidence. We have no proof of this. We
Yes.
weren't there.
How can you
Must be.
defend yourself when the accusation is that they were regularly accusing people's spirits of coming and attacking them? So how do you defend
That's
yourself
right.
against that?
Well, how do you? And it seems to me the parallels with false sex allegations are today are extraordinary. There was a book by, what's her name, Gillian Flynn, called Dark Places, about how in the 80s in America, the satanic witch cult grew up. And, and people were accused of torturing children and satanic ritual sexual abuse. And it's all linked, no doubt about this. It's all linked to religious fervor and fundamentalism. That's what the Crucible is about. That's what the Scarlet Letter is about. And then
Right.
you enlist the state authorities, the social workers, the police officers, and they go on for the ride. And the
Yeah.
false sex allegation has become an awful feature of our time, and it's closely linked to ignorance, superstition, and I hate to say it, evangelical Christianity, and the perception of those we disagree with as satanic. And it's really very dangerous. Now, of course, the other thing is the way lawyers are portrayed in all of this. In The Crucible, Danforth, the crucial lawyer, is insisting on the literalism of the law, which is also something there also in the Scarlet Letter. It doesn't matter who's right and wrong. We need a confession here. We need a sacrifice. Otherwise, the law will be held in disrespect.
Right.
And that is completely the wrong way of looking at things. But it shows how the establishment, not dissimilar to the Dreyfus affair, they must have a victim. If the thing becomes a pandemic of hysteria, someone's got to be blamed.
I think in the Scarlet Letter, it's important that the woman be seen to be on the scaffold, that the
Yes.
crowd has to watch her there in this obscene spectacle.
Yes, it's naming and shaming. The modern version of the Scarlet Letter scaffold is naming and shaming, or the spreading of gossip and hysteria. But yes, the scaffold is a way of public order and control, isn't it? A bit like the point you made in the previous broadcast about executions. I think you quoted Foucault and that incredible opening to one of his books, is it Discipline and Punishment, where he describes an execution. And public executions were a source of cheap entertainment, as indeed can show trials be a source of cheap entertainment, and they're a way of social ordering and denunciation. And the Nazi trials conducted by Freisler were like that as well, particularly the Sophie Scholl trial. People
Right.
have to be made an example of. The
Right.
integrity of the system, even if it's fascist, has to be upheld. We have to name and shame and therefore guillotine this young girl for spreading leaflets.
Mm.
And that's in a comical way what the legendary play The Front Page is about. I mean, I say it's a legendary play, and it was, by Hector MacArthur. The film versions with Cary Grant is one, His Girl Friday, and Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon in The Front Page, directed by Billy Wilder later, are fabulous. They're just fabulous. And they're based in the Sacco and Vanchetti case at the turn of the century in America, which was, of course, the framing of Italian immigrants for subversive activities by state authorities. And the front page is a satire of that milieu. The local politicians want this poor guy executed because there's an election coming. Yeah, and it reminds me of Gene Kerrigan's book, Round Up the Usual Suspects, or Round Up the Local Whorehouses. Politicians never really change. And the fact that the guy is dupe and completely innocent doesn't concern them in the least. Enter Walter Burns, the legendary corrupt shyster newspaper proprietor, and his star reporter, Hildy Johnson. And they expose the whole thing fantastically. And it's hysterical as well.
Hypocritical editor character. The editor is a bit like the judges or something like that.
I
Previous
mean,
work.
he is and he isn't. I mean, he's a portrayal of American gutter press shyster journalism.
Yeah.
They might have been mendacious and corrupt, some of those people. Mencken, perhaps the classic example, the editor of the Baltimore Herald, we'll come back to him, and the guy who covered and was responsible for the monkey trial, the Scobays trial, as well as writing a book on the American language and some of the greatest pieces of journalism of all time. And he was scurrilous. They were muckrakers, but their heart was often in the right place. It was in favor of truth, justice, and against cant.
Yeah, I think
And,
Mencken was
people.
covered in mud, but I think Mencken was holding a bit of a light as well.
Right, that's right. I think, people today, like even the editor of the Village magazine, could learn from that tradition. It was pretty fearless, They were pretty fearless people, and
Oh,
they
yeah.
had no holdbacks whatsoever. I mean, if you were to read Mencken's famous obituary. Speaking of the Scobays trial, it's probably worth mentioning at this time. Yeah, the Scopes trial was the monkey trial,
Right.
where Clarence Darrow legendarily represented this teacher prosecuted for teaching Darwinism.
Yeah.
Now, what is little known, or not as well known, is Darrow wouldn't have got the brief because the American Council for Civil Liberties didn't want him. He was too old. They figured he was drinking too much. He was too controversial for starters, and they wanted some preppy young lawyer. In fact, it became Darrow's greatest triumph, followed by even greater triumphs afterward. Well, as great triumph, it completely renewed his career, and he went on for about 20 years afterwards, more, I think. But he was prosecuted by a man who was 3 times presidential candidate, William Jennings Bryan, who was a creature of populism. He narrowly, some people think, won presidential election. He did win, and he was in favor of the little guy. And to that extent, Darrow personally liked him. But on the other hand, he was a religious fundamentalist. Mencken didn't like him at all. Even though Darrow lost the trial, Bryan's victory of convicting this guy for teaching Darwinism, this teacher, Scobays, was Pyrrhic. There was world outcry. The whole thing was covered on radio. Darrow's cross-examination of Bryan crucified him. And in the film Inherit the Wind, where Darrow's played by Spencer Tracy, and it's based on a play, Bryan dies in the courtroom. Now, he didn't die in the courtroom. He died 1 week later. But back to Mencken and fearlessness. Have you ever read Mencken's obituary of William Jennings Bryan? I mean, I've never read any. You should read all of it. It's one of the great acerbic works of literature ever written. It concludes something like this. Bryan was a vulgar and common man, a cad undiluted. He was ignorant, bigoted, self-seeking, blatant, and dishonest. He seemed only a poor clod like those around him, deluded by a childish theology, full of an almost pathological hatred of all learning, all human dignity, all beauty, all fine and noble things. He was a peasant come home to the dung pile. Imagine a gentleman, and you have imagined everything that he was not. Jesus. I mean, no doubt Mencken was covered in muck.
This is scathing kind of tonality on the level of Karl Kraus.
On the level of Karl Kraus, same genre, and on the level of Swift.
Yeah.
Perhaps neither Kraus nor Mencken have anything like Swift's ambivalence and subtlety. I mean, this is straight for the jugular, And they're knocking around the same period, Kraus and Mencken.
Yes.
But we've lost some of that. I'm not saying, I mean, there's the boundaries of good taste, and that pushes it to the very nth degree. But we have lost fearless independent journalism in terms of exposing miscarriages of justice. And of course, The miscarriage in the Scobie's trial, it was clear as well he shouldn't have been prosecuted. It's not a criminal, well, it is a criminal prosecution, but there should never have been a prosecution. The whole
Mm.
thing was a show trial and a setup.
And I tell you one thing too, the implications of Darwin are still very unsettling for a lot of people to this day.
And in America, particularly, and with the rise and recrudescence of religious fundamentalism in America, I mean, that's basically what Coney Barrett and all the judges Trump has appointed are. They're brainwashed evangelical Christians. It's right back in fashion. The banning of the books is right back in fashion. The censoring of literature in the syllabus. It starts with Lolita, then it goes to James Joyce's Ulysses, and pretty soon we're going to be banning everything. It's like a modern day burning of the books. And I think the tendencies among some people in Ireland towards self education or education at home or school education are part of that same phenomenon. It's almost like we're returning to the Dark Ages. I mean, in his closing peroration in the Scobie's trial, Darrow talks about back to the Middle Ages. If we ban this, if we ban Darwin, we'll go back to the Middle Ages. The other thing, of course, is perversely, Darwin's very influential in a way he would not like today, which is the triumph of the fittest, social Darwinism, which is an American phenomenon largely he would not have approved of. And that's the corporate monsters and corporatocracy who run our universe. Darwin will always crisply distinguish between his theory of evolution and its social implementation. He didn't think it was a good idea to have the survival of the fittest as a way of social regulation. I think J.D. Vance probably does. So dark times. But of course, it's important back to the Crucible that Miller's false sex allegation and the hysteria and the power of brainwashed children or coerced children is an emblem for the McCarthy era. In other words, it was Miller's own prosecution, Arthur Miller's own prosecution in the 1950s by Joe McCarthy, the anti-communist demagogic politician, who attacked loads of people, not just Arthur Miller. And it was very brave of anyone to stand up against him. And of course, he was assisted at one level by Robert Kennedy. But most of all, he was assisted by that very nefarious man. This is McCarthy, Roy Cohn.
Mm.
And he really is worth discussing.
Definitely. Hey, but I'm going to put in a word for Marilyn Monroe here.
Yeah, go on.
You know, I don't know if she ever accused anybody, but if you could bring her spirit back to life, pull the pills out of her hand and resuscitate her, she might have stories to tell about a lot of these people.
Including Arthur Miller, I think. And he wrote a
Well,
very
yeah,
distasteful play about her. Is it called All That Fall, about their relationship, which was distasteful. And she was clearly falling apart. And I'm not sure how much he helped her. I think Joe DiMaggio helped her more. But if you were to go to her, you're right, if you brought her back to life, you'd get the whole lot of them exposed in a way that would make, I think, the Epstein affair
exactly.
presently look like minor potatoes. And no doubt Miller is not squeaky clean at one level, but I don't think he's in any way as bad as some of the other people that damaged Marilyn Monroe. From what I know, much of this then was behind closed doors. We didn't have the internet universe, which has created the Epstein affair. But let's deal with Roy Cohn, shall we?
Yeah,
Hello?
go for it.
To a modern audience, Roy Cohn was a great lawyer, but a very, very bad human being, an evil human being. He's immortalized in many things, but I suppose Al Pacino plays him best in the dramatization of Tony Kushner's play Angels Over America
Right,
towards
right.
the end of his life in the 90s.
Mm.
But if we backtrack, Cohen becomes famous as Joe McCarthy's anti-communist, anti-Jewish lawyer, even though he was Jewish, Cohen. Self-loathing, anti-communist hysteria, anti-homosexual, even though Cohen was. And he framed the Rosenbergs. It is not as such, the Rosenbergs were executed in Sing Sing for treason, despite an attempt by the legendary William O. Douglas to stay the execution. And the death penalty might not have been appropriate in context, but there was a political will in the 1950s to execute them. It's brilliantly demonstrated in
Mm.
Coover's book, The Public Burning, through the lenses. Coover's narrator is the vice president of America at the time. Who was the vice president of America? Richard Nixon. Nixon, Eisenhower, it was on their watch that they went to the electrocution. So, but it's quite clear that Cohn lobbied to get Ethel Rosenberg executed. And it was malicious, it was vindictive, and it was fabricated. And then, of course, he becomes much later Donald Trump's lawyer. Here we are treading on very gingerly things, aren't we? And, Trump says things about Cohen. He said in his first administration, Trump said, I wish Roy Cohn were here today, or where's my Roy Cohn? And Cohen helped Trump as a real estate strike breaking lawyer in the 1980s. And Angels Over America deals with him dying of AIDS, which he did, masking of his liver cancer in a fantastic performance of the Diabolique, which only Pacino is truly capable of, and reflecting on the whole Rosenberg thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that miscarriages of justice can cut in all sorts of different ways. And often it is what the Innocence Project calls prosecutorial misconduct, which leads to it. And prosecutorial misconduct, Cohen's misconduct, led to the conviction of whether the husband was guilty of espionage is irrelevant. He might have been, he probably was, although that's a judgment call on my behalf. The way Cohen went after Ethel Rosenberg was shocking. And of course, true Joe McCarthy, the way he went after everybody was shocking. But there are too many Roy Cohns in the universe today, unfortunately. But I'm very hard on prosecutors. I basically don't like them. I never have, really. And I don't understand the idea of inflicting cruelty on people and being vindictive and shrill about certain things. But of course, defense lawyers are not necessarily squeaky clean either in miscarriages of justice. Either there's incompetence, of course, as well. But there's also a different type of miscarriage of justice, isn't there? Exonerating the guilty or getting the guilty off.
Indeed.
And I suppose, and here we are very gingerly, aren't we? The literature and miscarriages of justice of recent vintage, I'm talking the 60s, 70s, and later, has examples of where blame is accorded where there wasn't a miscarriage. Paul Foot's lobbying for Henratty ultimately leads to the Court of Appeals saying no. And the again, I'm being very gingerly about all of this. Sometimes other things, political agendas, nationalism, come into play about whether people were. There's a distinction drawn between the safety of a conviction and whether someone was innocent. For example, the Guildford Four were innocent, yeah, but other considerations about safeties of convictions apply perhaps to other people, and one must be nuanced about it. But when a shrill political agenda takes over, there's something similar happening with Lucy Lethby in Britain at the moment.
Right.
You wonder whether and to what extent people blind themselves to the reality of what's happened.
Mm.
Now, the question of blame allocation, who's responsible, is a different thing, isn't it, really?
With Letby, were there, I mean, I'm coming around to the idea that she might be completely innocent, but I don't know for sure. But it does look that's the case, or if there's something really unsafe about her conviction, it looks like
Yes.
the institution protecting itself in a lot of ways.
Well,
As you
but
mentioned
it's very
before.
important to deal with procedural lies, misrepresentations, false expertise. I'm not saying any apply in that context, but mistakes made within the system, corruption, and so on, and whether it's innocence. There's
Mm.
a distinction between safety and innocence. Yeah,
Sure.
the Guildford Four were innocent, others may not have been. But the theme was convicting or exonerating the guilty. The best book on this, approached it obliquely initially, is by the legendary British judge who retired from the House of Lords very early and spent the rest of his life writing these tremendous books about the law, Lord Devlin. Now, Devlin himself has been accused by his daughter of certain things after he's dead. Dead can't answer back. So perhaps he's not blameless. And also, he acted in a certain amount of distaste because he didn't release his famous book, Easing the Passing, until after his death. He had written it beforehand, but it was about a trial he presided over called the Bodkin Adams trial, where a serial killer, a kind of prototype of Harold Shipman, or what Lucy Lethby is accused of being, got off. And Devlin was horrified by the whole thing.
You rehearsed just what was Bodkin Adams is the accused here.
Yeah.
There are kinds of crimes with killing of patients in those
That's
cases.
right. It's exactly the same as Shipman. Yeah, it's exactly
Older
the same
people.
dynamic.
Okay.
Yes, fortunes, wills, that kind of thing.
Okay.
And there's no doubt that he was guilty as sin. Devlin was shocked by all of this. So he writes this book, and Devlin blames it on what the Innocence Project called prosecutorial misconduct. The case was prosecuted by a guy called Reginald Manningham Buller,
Mhm.
who also became a House of Lords judge called Viscount Dillahorn. Quite a good judge, actually. But Devlin thought he was an idiot. Devlin had a real sense of his intellectual aristocracy and superiority. Through the entire book, he doesn't refer to him as Viscount Dillahorn or Reginald Manningham Buller, but Reggie. Reggie was
The names and
clubbable.
titles of this entire thing are pretty exquisite. I mean, Bodkin Adams
Reggie
couldn't
being
be
a
made up.
clubbable idiot. And basically, Devlin felt he screwed the whole thing up. And he got a serial killer acquitted by his incompetence. It's an extraordinary book. Niall McCarthy, the legendary Irish Supreme Court judge, reviewed it in the Dublin University Law Journal yonks ago. And at the end of his review, he said, in a most stimulating, if distasteful book, from memory, why was it necessary to be so hard on Reggie? But Devlin goes to town on him, pure hatred. The other example in recent vintage, much more recently, of course, is the O.J. Simpson case.
Exactly, yeah.
And I mean, obviously, I have to approach this very gingerly. I've worked with Barry Sheck. I have nothing but uniform admiration for him as a human being and tremendous decency. And the Innocence Project is full of some of the nicest folks on the planet, really. To be perfectly honest, So I'm not, but Simpson was guilty. And the thing that's most extraordinary came out in the documentary is there were two limbs to the defense. One limb was, of course, the race card, in itself hysteria. But the second limb was if the famous line, which coined by Cochrane, or was it, if the glove don't fit, it quit.
Oh, I think that was him, yeah.
Yeah, and in the documentary recently, and this was the talk of people close and affiliated to the Innocence movement, and I'll approach this very gingerly. It is established that Simpson had arthritis. I think he had osteoporosis as well, and that he was told to stop taking his arthritic medication, and his hands would swell.
Mhm.
Uh, Crossing a line, it is said in the documentary. Well, that's not crossing a line, that's fabricating evidence. Whoever's responsible for it.
Sorry, run it by me again.
Well, his glove
Simpson was
didn't fit. Simpson suffered from osteoporosis, or
where he was told to put the glove on within the courtroom.
if you
His
don't
hands were
take your
swollen.
medication, the hands will get.
That's even more ingenious. He was also his team were advised by Alan Dershowitz at the start. I don't know if you know that factoid.
I did. I knew that Dershowitz is an appellate lawyer, and he doesn't do trials, or didn't.
No, he gave the advice. He was pre-trial. He prepared.
I think he selected what became known, I think, modeled in American baseball as the dream team. In fact, I know this. I
That's right. Yeah.
shouldn't even introduce any circumspection. I know this. And Barry was brought in as the DNA expert. And Cochrane and Shapiro, who like Pontius Pilate at the end of the whole thing, disowned it, or the Judas kiss was given to the rest of the team at the end, and Shapiro redirected his entire practice towards entertainment and civil law. And also, of course, yeah, he did. And also, of course, the legendary, disbarred subsequently, F. Lee Bailey was part of the team as well.
Right. Wow.
But this was selected, I believe, by Dershowitz, I'm not sure Dershowitz entirely approved of F. Lee Bailey. Certainly, he's very colourful in some of his books about what he says about him. But no doubt Bailey was a great barrack room trial lawyer. And, defense lawyers also can be responsible for exonerating the guilty. And sometimes the Simpson case left a very bad taste in mouth. And there are recent trials in Ireland which suggest that, distasteful evidence of irrelevant to a trial of animal cruelty should not have been introduced, or counts in the indictment allow for people to be acquitted when other counts might have found them guilty, or traveling communities being demonized, and of course also witnesses disappearing in mysterious circumstances in Spain after refreshments with Angarda Síochána. Now, whoever's responsible for all of this, but the establishment, of course, back to Paths of Glory, massages over the level of its responsibility. You've made this point to me, it's by diffusion and by the reallocation of different realms of responsibility that the establishment gets on.
Right.
No,
To close it out, and we didn't prep it, but we've circled back to Ireland a little bit, but I have to ask you to put in a word or just an image in your mind to the trial of Oscar Wilde,
oh
which
yeah,
was no less theatrical and weird, and I think even to this day, it should be haunting for people. It's not exactly it's not as simple as the crucifixion of a kind of gay Messiah. Things were a
well,
little bit more complicated within it and
they
within Oscar
were.
Wilde's life.
There are all sorts of complications. The first complication is, of course, Wilde and Carson had been at Trinity together.
Right,
I know
exactly.
this very well because I performed in the College Historical Society in an event that was sold out, with Alice Glynn and David Norris giving evidence, and Patrick Healy, funny enough, playing Oscar Wilde, and I was playing Sir Edward Carson, and we based Ulick O'Connor's playing. There was a queue from the College Historical Society in Trinity all the way down Westmoreland Street to come and see it. That was when events in the Historical Society were public events. I don't think that's quite as true as today as it was then.
Hmm.
But I know this stuff inside out. And Carson Wilde didn't like each other. And Carson was, of course, very Presbyterian and very devout. That's the first context that needs to be put in. The second thing is that in the trial, if you need a transcript, first of all, it's a libel trial. It's
Yeah.
because the Marquis of Queensberry goes to Wilde's club and says, when he is having this affair with Lord Alfred Douglas, and the Marquis of Queensberry was an unappetizing and unsavory man. That's true. And he misspelt it when he dropped the calling card
Yeah.
at Wilde's club and said to Oscar
Somdomite.
Wilde, posing as a sodomite. But Wilde shouldn't have sued. That's the point.
Exactly.
It was true. Um, Now, whether the law is an ass, which of course it was, and it's been subsequently abolished, and of course it is a persecutory law and a distasteful and immoral law, but nonetheless, Wilde should not have sued. And God knows why he did. He was at the height of his fame, the importance of being earnest, all that jazz. And then in the cross examination by Carson, he goads Carson mercilessly. He treats Carson. A witness box is not the place for an artist or a stage performer. Beckett was a disaster as a witness in the Oliver St. John
Exactly.
Gauger
Yeah.
libel trial, and Wilde was an overconfident disaster. He's goading Carson for days on end, playing with him, getting cheap laughs from the gallery. But Carson's a Rottweiler. He's persistent. He's a lawyer. And he asks him this question about a boy, I think, called Granger. And he says, did you kiss him? And Wilde, trying to be funny, said, oh no, he was far too ugly.
Yeah.
And then Carson just moves in for the kill. So you did kiss other boys who weren't ugly. And the whole thing explodes in
That's it.
Wilde's
I mean, it's
face.
a little bit like with Casement. I mean, it's different, but the homosexuality, the homoeroticism is just radioactive. You can't bring it into those Victorian Edwardian courtrooms and allow it to kind of anoint you and then get away. As soon as you're
Except look at Roy
public,
Cohn, although it's much later. I mean, the normalization structure has gone the other way. In Victoriana, no, yes, obviously that's the case. Um, there's one other thing speaking of that, just very briefly, one thing we haven't mentioned which is important, is the demonization of people on the basis not just of homosexuality, but race.
hmm
So if you look at Forster's book, A Passage to India, and Forster was homosexual, his book Maurice shows. It's about this guy Aziz who's falsely accused of sexual assault,
Yes, yes.
and it's racial in motivation. And there's a book by Richard Wright touching on this called Black Boy as well. And we're no doubt entering an age where mixed race, interracial coupling, all of that has become, to certain vested interests, deeply troublesome. And of course, it ties into the anti-immigrant hysteria
I'm going to remind you
that's
at this point that J.D. Vance is married to an Indian woman, but actually within even the MAGA and rising right world, he gets a certain amount of shade for that exact thing.
yes, and if you remember the Lidl ad in Ireland, which showed a mixed race couple, had them being evicted from the country, or when a non-national stabbed, was it a boy in Dublin a couple of years ago, and a Brazilian driver rescued them. I said,
So did several other people, by the way. It wasn't just one Brazilian.
yeah, yeah, but there was the demonization of it as a racial act, as opposed to other people being involved. I mean, the best book in all of this, the best film, is of course
To
with
Kill a
the
Mockingbird?
legendary. Yeah, and Gregory Peck is like the perfect shining white knight of lawyerdom, and Atticus Finch, because Atticus Finch, as is made clear in a subsequent book, was a flawed man of his time. He just didn't like people being framed, and he didn't like prejudice. And he's like the great moderate, liberal, conservative, iconoclastic figure. Peck himself was liberal with a very small L, and I think in many ways that's the best way to be. And of course, the whole engine of To Kill a Mockingbird is a black man falsely accused of a sexual allegation. And no doubt we're dealing with a dark age of miscarriages of justice based on racial stereotyping and demonization. And that is not even to mention the awful surfacing of potential anti Semitism again. It's always like when that happens, it's always a sign that we're reverting in time.
Hmm.
But I suppose, participants within the criminal justice system are flawed, capable of prejudice, try to avoid them as possible. But throughout the entire history of literature, to revert to something at the beginning, Emile Zola, just as much as Atticus Finch, shines the torch of truth and justice.
And of course, legs it to London, but actually we admire him for that. I do.
It's better to walk away
Uh,
from
Live to
nonsense.
fight another day.
Yes, the essays even after Jacques were brilliant enough. And when I said his later novels were minor, well, that's relative. Truth, the last one, was a reconnection with his genius, I think. It modeled on the Dreyfus affair, but factually dissimilar and well worth reading. But, Zola stands unique, I think, on a pedestal. We haven't even mentioned, so we should. And you mentioned earlier Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. I mean, because of course that is classically about a man falsely accused, Jean Valjean, or rather persecuted for the theft of a loaf of bread, who's the absolute opposite of Jean-Baptiste Clemence, a man of principle, of integrity, of good Samaritan work, and chased by Gervais. And Gervais is like the prosecutor Danford, is it, in Crucible. It's someone who insists on the literalism of the law. Somebody, and of course, at the end of the huge saga that is Les Miserables, I've read the 1,200-page version. I found out recently there's a 2,200-page version. Gervais apologizes and says he is
Mm.
wrong. That is what the establishment should do more often,
I think
but
it's
they don't.
extraordinary that there hasn't been much in the way of Irish theatre, film, or otherwise about old Irish trials. If people could go back through assizes and lists and things from the past, from the penal times in the 19th century, they would be just so shocked at what ordinary people were subjected to for these crimes. Stealing bread could easily be one long before the famine, taking a chicken, poaching, and then you're sent to Australia, then you're, confined, you're executed for these kinds of things by this
I mean,
absolutely brutal judiciary, and we
yeah,
don't,
but
people,
it's the little guy, whether they're a minority or not, and it's the poor person. I mean, Gillian Flynn's book, Dark Places, is about prejudice in the local community where there's lots of poverty, and the poor person doesn't have the weapons to fight back as much, and the rich. I'm sounding like a communist here, but the rich have the resources, and with threats to legal aid, with the diminution of the role of the criminal defense lawyer, and with increasing middle class poverty and institutionalized poverty as
Exactly.
the neoliberal society collapses around us. I mean, genteel poverty doesn't really exist anymore. Then the weapons to fight back against a state, and that's why people like Darrow and people are so courageous. And it's why someone like Zola, staking his entire reputation, which he did, is so courageous in all of this. And the poor person is the victim of people who are much more powerful militias and funded, often trying to frame them. And they don't. In Ireland, the matrix is full of cover-ups and lies, adding to the endless bullshit. I mean, certain members of the Irish judiciary would do very well to look carefully at the concluding part of Zola's J'accuse, and for that matter, watch Paths of Glory, which is another evisceration of the French establishment, because I don't think the present Irish establishment, without naming names, is much better.
Mm-hmm.
And in a world of poverty, demonization, and prejudice, you have to have the weapons to fight back, and or people who will take up the cudgels for you without themselves being neutralized.
We'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Not at all. All the best. Take care.